Okay, any questions? Put your hand up. We've got one here.
Hi. Is that okay? Yeah. As a humble front-end developer, how worried should we be about the rise of WebAssembly and programs like Rust?
Sorry, I missed the question.
Sorry, could you just repeat that a little louder? You asked about what
Sorry.
should we worry about WebAssembly?
WebAssembly and the rise of programs like Rust and how...
Just, yeah?
Yeah.
All right, who wants to give their hot take?
I think.
Oh yeah, definitely this guy.
So if I understood the question, is it about what will happen with WebAssembly and JavaScript? Yeah? I think they'll complement each other really well. JavaScript will probably make sense for 95% of all the things that are built for the web. And then WebAssembly will make sense for the things that need a bit more performance. Or another cool thing that I'm excited about is that WebAssembly will enhance JavaScript libraries. For example, some people at Mozilla, they are working on a WebAssembly virtual DOM differ. And if you could make that work with React together with, so you have WebAssembly for the virtual DOM diffing and you have React as the JavaScript API, then you can maybe get a very fast React, for example. So I think that there are many interesting ways that WebAssembly can be applied, but I don't think that JavaScript will ever go away, so to say, because JavaScript it's very approachable, JavaScript. And yeah, I think that's why they will both coexist.
One thing I want to mention is the work that Vincent Reamer has done with React Native DOM and how he made Yoga, the layout engine, work in WebAssembly, which is the layout engine for React Native. And I think that's very interesting. Another thing that's intriguing to me is how WebAssembly will allow for people to write not just JavaScript, but other languages that compile to the WebAssembly bytecode, I think it's called. So it's very interesting. I'm very excited to see what languages will arise to that occasion.
I see you, Paul. Or no, yeah, it's Paul.
And one last thing to add to all of that, I think, is good examples for WebAssembly. I heard from people at the Figma team. If you know Figma, it's a design tool that you can use in the browser. Good examples for WebAssembly would be like image manipulation, some of the things that take a little bit more processing power, and there are already really good libraries from native code that can do these things, so you can actually share a lot of these bigger things. And especially like 3D physics engines are another really good example of that. There are a lot of good C++ implementations of 3D physics, and why try and rewrite all of that in JavaScript when you could just cross-compile it to WebAssembly?
Run another way down. Oh, I should be doing
One more thing to add, why not constantly use it? Because there's a bridge. You basically, when you're going from JavaScript to WebAssembly, there's a little bit of a cost associated to that, and that's so it's not for free. So if you like for every little operation you go to WebAssembly and back to JavaScript, and you basically have to serialize and deserialize, there's a cost. So it's not like out of the box, whatever you write in WebAssembly is automatically faster, because a lot of things that you can write in JavaScript, if you write bad Rust code, it still can be way slower than you write something, a better algorithm in JavaScript. So yeah, be careful with that when you, it's not by default better, faster, cooler.
Can I add one last thing?
Keep going.
There will be no second question.
So there was a point for when I was testing Code Sandbox, and I wanted to support ripgrab inside Code Sandbox. So I tried to compile the Rust library ripgrab to Code Sandbox, no, to WebAssembly and used in Code Sandbox, but it turned out to be slower than JavaScript reg expressions because there was so much overhead with sending strings over to the reg expression library and sending back the results. So it doesn't work in every scenario, and you'll have to try it out, and they're going to make this data transfer faster and faster. It's insane with how fast Mozilla has been doing improvements over WebAssembly. But yeah, it's always a thing to look at.
No silver bullets. Next question. We got one up front here.
Hi, we spend a lot of time talking about how we fetch data. I think that's something that we're really getting good at, especially with suspense. It's exciting things. There is though one thing that I think that the community doesn't really cover as much as maybe we should, or I don't know if you know any projects like this. It's related to receiving data and pulling data without asking for it. And it has a bunch of consequences in terms of scheduling. You don't really know when you're getting something. You don't really know when to work on something. And are we as a community looking at those problems, or is this something that probably we should start exploring?
Anyone? Yeah, we pass it on down. I can answer that too. So fetching data, I'll give you my perspective from a GraphQL standpoint, maybe, and what we see with a lot of our customers, right? So usually a lot of our conversations are around the GraphQL spec, which has, 3 primary operations: queries, mutations, and subscriptions, right? But it doesn't actually, the spec doesn't, as we have Lee here, right? It doesn't specify a transport protocol. It's just very common that everyone does this over HTTP. Now, an interesting thing usually when we talk about live data, right, is you're talking about some sort of publisher or subscription pattern. These have different implementations that go along with them. The most common way, which is what we support, is an event-based publishing mechanism, right? A change to data or an event on your backend actually publishes to subscribers that goes out, which honestly meets the needs of usually like 80 to 90% of applications, right? And I'm sure Lee could talk about this as well. Like there were things that, if you think about how Facebook works, right? I like a post, it notifies other people. Where it gets a little tricky, then you have to decouple it in a couple of places, right? Is on the client, then you start to get into what sort of state management libraries that you use for notifications, right? I could actually give a lecture on the differences between caches and stores here that I don't want to go into right now. But usually you look at, if you are using some sort of state management library, that's why a lot of people like, for instance, MobX for actually just putting decorators on classes or other things, right? On the back end where things get really complex is trying to do targeted notifications of updates, especially when it comes to state, right? Because discussions usually go into things around like live queries, which is an algebraic result of a query that's run. And then you really need to track identities on the back end and who's actually subscribing to that data and notify those groups. So doing that at scale for 100 users isn't too bad. When you get into thousands, it's a mess. Yeah. I don't know. Lee, you have any? Yeah.
I'll add a little color on this just because we've thought so much about it over the years at Facebook and in community conversations as well. GraphQL only covers a little bit of it. It covers subscriptions only because we found the solution space to be small there, and it was worth speccing it so that people could build shared tools. But for other kinds of real-time data, GraphQL doesn't necessarily not cover them. It's just that the spec doesn't tell you how. So we left plenty of room for people to go explore those things. And as was previously stated, the transfer protocol is left up to you so that you can have that room to go explore. But real-time data is just really hard. I think that's part of the reason why, even though there's a lot of conversations among the community, there are a few tools that are just broadly used, because every problem has subtly different characteristics, subtly different things that you trade off against. Like the system that you would use to build WhatsApp or a messaging client would need to be very different from the system you would want to build for Google Docs. Even though they're both very live, they have wildly different characteristics. And even something like a Google Doc, it's not built to have 1 million people editing the same Google Doc at the same time. It's built to have at most hundreds, right? So they're very different sort of trade-offs for each of these products call for different technical considerations. So I think the space is super fascinating, and when someone stumbles on one of these ideas and shares them, we all learn a lot. So I think there's a lot of value to be talking about this as a community and being realistic about the trade-offs between the things that work and that don't work. One of the talks yesterday about the skip language I thought was particularly interesting because skip was designed to make some headway on this problem. And one of the reasons why it didn't end up sort of rebuilding Facebook is that it's a generally hard problem where every product has different trade-offs. And so skip solves some, but not all of those. But I think it's super interesting. So if you're interested in real-time space, you should check out the skip language because it's a really interesting way to dive into adding syntactical and runtime additions to a language to help solve that problem.
I have a question. Does skip compile to WebAssembly? Is that a thing?
I have no idea. I don't know if Julian is here. If he is, he can answer the question.
All right, cool. We got another one in front here.
Yeah. Hi, I really like Lee's talk when he talks about that PHP now is like 80% of the web, right? And my question is like, you have to achieve this hegemony maybe, and everybody will benefit from it. So my question is, I mean, for all of you, how much are you willing to give up the technology you talked about, be it Reason, GraphQL, Expo, in order to like achieve a unification? Will you be willing to do that? I mean, even if the technology, which is the other one, is inferior in your eyes, but do you see some benefit in being united? Does it make sense to you?
I guess like, I'm going to jump in here. I guess
Yeah.
like the interesting thing is, I know, we're all here because we're building products, we're building tools, right? And oftentimes the choice of technology is just like a means to an end. And so like whatever it is that gets the job done and it works, and you know, you always improve things, and you don't just want to jump ship just because there's some new hot stuff there. And great example, you know the site Nomad List? You familiar with the site? It's a PHP app. $1 million a year application run by like one or two people. It's not, you know, Kits has a great talk about just like follow the money and just kind of like give up on adopting the newest, sexiest thing, and you'll liberate yourself and your conscious and your productivity. And so I think like, I mean, other people can jump in. Like, I think that's always where you got to start as the baseline, and then, I don't know, sort of put blinders on sometimes.
I love that answer because that resonates strongly with how I think about things. Like, we're all here talking about new technologies, and we can share the stories about the bleeding edge and the new projects that we're launching, new libraries, new languages, which is exciting because when we bump into a problem that just feels like a thorn in our side and we see a new technology that can make headway on that, it's really exciting. But ultimately, like, we're all here building products. Like, we're making stuff for people. Like, the technology is a means to an end. And I think that's a huge reason why PHP is so popular, is because there's plenty wrong with PHP. But I love PHP because it's ubiquitous. Like, I don't love it for technical details. Like, I love it because it's ubiquity. So I think there's something to be said for that. Maybe React will become that one day. Like, there'll be plenty of quote-unquote better solutions, and React will have just been around and people will be so familiar with it that that's actually ends up being its thing that's most valuable, is it has ubiquity and that's it. That'll still be valuable, but I mean, I hope React continues to get better. But I also hope there's other technologies that go beyond it.
Let me revamp the question a little bit, though. I think there's also something to be said for the value of a community in a given technology is very important, right? So like TypeScript, it just got to critical mass. So if you're starting a new project, you probably should consider it, at least. So I think there's also that flip side, but like I don't know, there's the balance and trade-offs in all things in the universe. I'm sure other people have more comments there too.
Yeah, I think when you're building software, it's not just the technology that you have to think about. You might prefer a particular technology because of its merits, but you're also building software as part of a team, or you need to recruit people. So there might be other reasons. I talked to someone who said they were moving to React because it'd be easier to find developers from the technology they're using. And you have to balance all those considerations, maybe not just the technological merits.
You should just migrate everything to Svelte now.
So I work for a consulting firm called Wrangle.io, and I work with clients all the time. Typically, we just like ask them like what their developers are most used to, and how they can get used to like React or Angular or anything, all the other different popular frameworks. And the reality is that if 90% of the developers are really solid on Angular 7 or 6 or whatever, then they're most likely going to go with that. So I guess like technology, it should be like technology agnostic, right? It's just the product that you're building, that should be pretty solid. And you should make like conscious decisions on like what you want, what picking, and then why. And you have a solid reason for it, rather than, oh, I'm just like picking React because it's very popular and everyone else wants to pick React, which is true, but in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as you grow as a developer too, you start to have guiding principles and your own philosophy, and it becomes, you see new tools and you're like, I don't get it, like why would I use that? Or you just start, holding your own grudges and opinions, and you're believing your own nonsense, and forming your own religion in your own mind as to like what's the right way of doing something. And I don't know, most people just probably stick with that or argue about it till, I don't know, they convince their bosses or teammates or friends or get fired. I don't know. It's like, that's what ends up happening, right? So I don't know. It's a great question though. I don't think there's an answer. You just got to do what works. What else we got? Anybody? Okay, keep going.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I maybe wasn't clear, definitely. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. The problem is, let's say, look at Flow and TypeScript. It took years while these two technologies were competing with each other.
Yeah.
But in the end, we're trying to solve the same problem.
Sure.
And my question is, at a certain point, when you are, let's say, a Flow developer, you have to like say, I will not continue. I will give up this idea of building Flow in order to support like making types more used. And therefore, I will kind of switch to TypeScript side because we are in the end fighting the same battle.
This happened to me.
Yes.
This happened to my company.
I was also a Team Flow here, right?
Flow is what's up. And also Flow was married to React, and
Yeah,
it just seemed easier, right?
Exactly.
And the problem is that it was a community thing, right? So the fact that TypeScript had buy-in at Microsoft and Google because of Angular, and also just the entire VS Code aspect of it. And I guess also, I'll just bring it up, like Atom and Nuclide just couldn't, I don't know, like, it wasn't as snippy and fast and optimized for Flow. It was good, but VS Code was on a different planetary level. And again, having another framework like bought into it already, that was like a tipping point, and these things are inertial, right? Then you just, when it came a day where it's like, oh, I could cover my types by 85% versus 25%, and that's when you switch.
So the question I want to ask is that how prepared are you that you will be the Flow of the future with your technology?
I want to add specifically on the Flow versus TypeScript because I think that's really interesting, and hopefully we can extract from there to talk about other things. So one I think is like a super clear parallel to draw is programming languages, right? We should all bail and use C++, right? It's the most popular programming language. It has been for decades, and it probably still will be. Why are we doing anything other than C++? C++ solves the same problem that Ruby solves, that Python solves, that all of these languages solve, so why pick another one? They have different trade-offs, they have different values, and that leads them to different decisions. If you have two things that compete that are more or less identical, then you pick the one that wins, and then the other one dies. That's okay. And in fact, I think Flow and TypeScript are more similar than different, and that's part of why there's ambiguity there. There are actually different values at play, which is part of the reason why the projects still coexist. Flow cares more about scalability on extremely large code bases, and it cares more about the soundness of the type system. And TypeScript, there's plenty of cases where they'll admit, we gave up on soundness for user experience. We want better error messages, or this, while sound is hard to understand, so we made a different choice. And that's also totally reasonable, different value to take. The fact that they both have very different sized communities, I think, influences that. I think they had 50-50 community size, which they did earlier on. Then you kind of just pick the one that you favor, or you pick the values that stick to you more. And you see the same thing happen with different communities. So we as web engineers gravitate to JavaScript because it's the lingua franca for building stuff there. If you're a data engineer, it's likely that you use Python. Could you do data science with JavaScript? Sure. Could you have done it with Ruby? Absolutely. Why Python? Because the entire community uses Python. So I think at some point you're going to see gravitation to these. just because of a community buildup. But the other part that I think is really useful is when you have multiple technologies in a similar space that compete, then they borrow ideas from each other, which is a great thing. So for example, the first versions of TypeScript had no concept of nullability. Whereas Flow had a concept of nullability because it borrowed that from the hack language, which is Facebook's derivation of PHP. And then people started to complain that TypeScript didn't have nullability checking while Flow did. And so there was a knowledge sharing between the two. And then the same thing happened with error messages, where error messages and IDE integration was much better on TypeScript. So Flow started to prioritize those things. So these projects get much better as a result of having the competition in the space as well. So I'm not sure what will happen next. I think it's pretty clear that the open source community is leaning much more heavily towards TypeScript than Flow. I think that's totally reasonable. I'm really happy to see that Flow made extremely positive contributions to TypeScript as a result. And I think it's also very in line with how Facebook likes to think about open source projects, or at least the teams that I worked on, how they thought about open source projects. So the goal is not to get a ton of people using your software. That's actually a cost, right? If you support more people, that's a maintenance burden. It's great if you build a community that can be worth it, but the more ideal thing to shoot for is to have the ideas that you introduce influence the community. So having Jest influence Enzyme and influence all these other testing frameworks was awesome. If nobody uses Jest, but Jest made a positive impact on testing frameworks, that's great. If Flow makes a positive impact on type checking and everyone uses TypeScript, but TypeScript is better as a result, that's a success. We had the same thought with React back in 2013 when we open sourced it and people hated it. We had our fingers crossed that at the very least people would take the ideas and incorporate it into existing solutions and that the ideas of React would live on. So when we saw React starting to influence Angular with Angular 2, we got super excited about that. Like if React died and Angular 2 ended up being React inspired, that still would have been a win in the end run. So I think it's important that, even if you think the space is crowded, but you've got a different angle, a different value, a different principle, it's still worth incorporating just to help move other projects along as well.
Perfect summary. But one thing to add, maybe what I see, especially when there's a smaller community, you definitely want to have good guidance, but you need the openness for innovation. Otherwise, innovation can't happen if you don't let people make different trade-offs. And this is exactly what happened between TypeScript and Flow. People having different opinions, trying different things out, and then you can see what works better or not, and applies to different use cases. But I think what's still really valuable is to have kind of the idea of a coherent stack that works well together, and especially in the React or so, they telling people these are libraries that work well with it, but others maybe don't, and then you can have for beginners, guide them this is working well, and you can try this out. This is proven, and this is something that is experimental. But I think it's very, very important for innovation to leave it open and let people do things. And sometimes if you bet on something, you might be wrong. Then you have to fix it.
Any other questions? Anybody else want anything to say? We feel I can see it coming out.
All right, Mr. iPhone.
Thanks for awesome talks. I would like to ask, how do you think will UI components be ever standardized on the level of the browser? So for example, if we take a look at the date picker, which is it exists in a browser, but nobody uses it. Every UI component library reinvents it from scratch, and it's not really looks alike in any different browser. And I think nobody pays much attention to the UI baked in the browser. So we have a couple of checkboxes, inputs, but it's not usable things. So everyone builds on top of these, but it's not like sensible defaults. Why it happens and whether it's going to change in the future.
Paul, I feel like you have something to say about that.
I think Paul should answer this one.
Or maybe Evan should. I don't know.
I was going to talk about Twitter.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah.
So I actually don't think so. So you're right. The browsers have implemented input type equals date, and to be frank, they're all kind of crappy. I don't think any of them get them done very well. To that sense, we've always kind of had what are called HTML replaced elements. That's part of the HTML spec is called a replaced element. That would be checkbox or radio or input. Basically any form element is a replaced input. So these are a type of standardized visual type of UI element. However, I basically just think designers are never going to let that happen. Designers are always going to want something that's not standard. They're always going to want to try and push into a new space and a new look and have things a certain way. And I think it's just going to prevent any real push to have a good standard UI element for all of these types of things across the board.
Evan has a...
Yeah, I think like something that we see a lot, especially with things like Twitter and Instagram, where they build apps that they try to make look like ubiquitous across every platform, is that you do default to certain UI elements. So like React Native, for instance, it has the date picker, and then it looks different on iOS and Android, and then things that try to be like more like a PWA or a web app tend to also go towards these elements that are better for accessibility and then better for devices. And I think just like the more devices that you try to support, the more you're going to fall back on built-in elements, and I see that a lot. So, but I agree with your whole designers don't let things just be, and that's cool.
Yeah, so I think that there's like a happy middle ground that I think it gets a bit of traction now, and I hope it gets more. The select is a good example, because building a select from scratch is actually a lot of work, especially if you want it to be accessible and to work in all kinds of environments and work the way users expect. So what I've seen a lot is that you have a select element, but you mask the thing that you click on, the trigger. But when you click on it, you still get the standard browser dropdown. And I think that's actually not a bad way to go, because then the designers are happy because they can style the way that it looks when it's static, but you still can leverage the browser. Because I think that, yeah, especially for date pickers, it's a tall order to have the browsers build a date picker that people would just be able to use out of the box. But yeah.
Yeah, so recently I feel like we have a rise of UI kits on the web ecosystem, and they especially like configurable UI kits, like semantic UI. You can override the styles and use patterns and still keep these things that your designer wants to have while keeping like patterns. So maybe in the future we have like with more and more UI kit established everywhere, have a new standard, having browser that provides like better primitives, API, or primitive components that are more configurable than the current one.
Yeah, it makes all sense in the world. I don't think it's going to get solved. Like, it's too easy for the design team to be like, nah, I don't really like that. I'm going to add a little thing here. That's what happens. Any other questions? No? Got any in the back? Oh, one in the front. Brent, right in the front.
So Jared, at the beginning of the conference, was talking about making React accessible to everyone, and bringing in new developers and being very acceptant of them. I think one thing that React has done over the last year is with the release of Fiber, we've seen a lot of developer experiences come about that have made, I guess, React a lot more approachable. Do you guys see anything, foresee anything in the next year before like the next React Europe that's going to be huge, maybe something like hooks and suspense that we saw last year, that's going to make it even more approachable and bring, whether it's novice developers or developers who are more advanced who just haven't switched over to React yet, into React and make React more approachable? Do you foresee anything, or is this something that you can't answer because you're not part of the React core team? Does anyone have any ideas?
I can talk about it. Yeah, I mean, like there was a recent podcast that Dan Abramov gave about just like the React team and how they're working now, and he said like, I'm paraphrasing, we've checked off all the checkboxes and gotten all the easy wins. Now we're working on moonshot and more long-term vision projects. And so what that means is that you're not going to see these like every month something brand new that you've never even heard of before come out. There's going to be a longer headway and you're going to know more about it. But it also means that they're like dog fooding internally and they're trying to get things right. So when the next thing does come, it'll probably be pretty awesome. But you just may not have like the runway that maybe you're used to. As for like what will help to make like, here's your question about like making the world more approachable to the community, moving towards like, once we all like get our heads wrapped around hooks a little bit more, that will help as we move towards this like JavaScript universe. And just as the blog posts get updated, and we're in this interesting state where if you look up a blog post 50-50, it's written with a class and with a hook now, right? Or not even. So when that stabilizes, I think that will also help too. So I don't know, maybe other people have other opinions about it.
Tim's not up here, but I think tools like Next.js as well are really bridging that gap to make things more approachable. Create React app, I think, was the first part of that, and I think Next took it to the next level. I think we're going to see more stuff like that. Expo maybe is another one. Maybe Evan can jump in now.
I'm glad you said it for me. My own stuff is what will be popular next year. Yeah, so I think Dan Abramov has also posted about like React Fire, and that's a similar approach to what we're doing with React Native Web, which is just like these primitives that apply to platforms that you can then drop down to and be more platform specific. I think React Fire will be a much broader, easier to approach version of that, and then it will probably ease more into people using primitives like view and text and image, hopefully, and then you can deploy them on any platform you want, and stuff like Marzipan 2 will change a lot of things maybe, depending on when it gets released, so you can run, instead of Chromium everywhere, maybe you want to run like an actual native OS X app on your desktop, and I imagine there will be new React developments with that as well.
I think also like of one project that's helping, at least on React DOM, is Ryan Florence's Reach UI. These are components that are really hard to get right, and people often don't get right because they don't get accessibility, they're not aware of all this, and Ryan's gone through an enormous amount of work and effort to make these components right and the APIs easy to use. And that is going to go a long way when it comes to like developer productivity. And like you don't need to implement the dialogue again. You don't need to implement this menu drop down. Like these components are like those things where you're like, should I use a UI kit? I don't know. Like this is now like something that's almost baked in at this point. And so I think we'll see a little bit as we move the combination of the Create React apps and code sandboxes, as well as these stronger primitives that nudge you to the right conclusion or the right processes and right workflows and right components. I think that's going to make things a lot easier. Anybody else? No? Okay, cool. Any other questions? Oh, be the one in front here.
I have a question for cross-platform. I know that Evan did a React Native Web. I just want to know your opinions on whether it's possible in the long run to see React on web, iOS, and Android. Like we can have like one repo where we can hit all three platforms, because that's something that a lot of us are looking for, because we don't want to have like multiple sets of engineers to hit each of these platforms. And I wanted to know, is React Native Web something that React developers would be like jump on the wagon for, because they're very used to like divs and that stuff. Like, is that something that they would be interested in?
I'm also very curious because I'm pushing very hard for that. So.
I have actually heard success stories. I don't have any particular ones off the top of my head. I believe, actually no, that's not true. I believe Lyft, the car like Uber, but Lyft, has had pretty good success doing just that, using React Native Web and React Native on their application. So there are success stories. At the same time, I think there are still always going to be, you're always going to have some native specific code for every platform. So while you're probably going to be sharing a lot of your code base, there's still going to be some need for some specialty in Android and in iOS and on web.
There's a really cool example app. It's on GitHub. It's called DevHub.
Beat me to it.
Oh, yeah. DevHub. It's a monorepo. the entire app is in the components directory. There's a component called app, and then it gets rendered on web and native and also Electron. And it's pretty nifty. It's pretty cool.
I think a lot of what will make this better and more approachable for people is just the environment becoming more unified at the base level. So like I talked about earlier, there's Metro on one side and Webpack on the other. And with React, you can use whatever kind of bundler you want to use, whereas with React Native, you can only use Metro. And I think that makes it pretty rigid and hard to get, to mix and match with different things. So if the environment gets more unified, I think people will be more intrigued by doing cross-platform development, but also I think cross-platform development, like universal app development, will be just really big this year, and I think React Native Web will do cool stuff, and I know the React Native team is very excited about it as well, so.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody. This about wraps up our Q&A. Thank you all for being awesome and yeah, throw the mic. No, I'm just kidding. Don't throw the mic, dude. Thank you all. You all are awesome. Thank you for coming to this conference. This has been an awesome, awesome time, and we'll all get to hang out soon and drink and be merry. Again, any other announcements? That's it. All right. Well, we'll see you all next year.